Spy Cops Info Podcast, a series on the secret undercover political police that infiltrated over 1,000 groups since 1968. Episode 34, Inquiry in Chaos. Welcome to the Spy Cops Info Podcast. My name's Tom Fowler and I'm joined with
Kate Wilson.
This should be being released on Monday, the 30th September 2024. And today was meant to be the beginning of Tranche 2, Phase 2 of the Undercover Policing Inquiry, but it isn't. The inquiry won't be starting today, and that's what we're talking about. I feel like this isn't a surprise to anybody who's been following the inquiry closely. Forever delayed. Everything gets delayed. We were told it was all going to be over by Christmas. It won't be. It's all change.
That's the news. We should be starting to hear opening statements today from counsel to the inquiry and the various lawyers representing the call participants. And we won't be, because the inquiry didn't get the bundle together, didn't get the disclosure out. And so nobody could write the opening statements, not even counsel to the inquiries. An announcement appeared on the inquiry website. The Undercover Policing Inquiry Tranche 2 Phase 2 evidence hearing schedule has been postponed for 2 weeks. This decision was made to allow all those involved, including the inquiry legal team, additional time for preparation. The hearings will now open on 14th and 15th of October, and live evidence will be heard from 21st of October. In reality, a lot of it's been put back more than 2 weeks. People who were supposed to be giving evidence, a lot of them now don't know when they're supposed to be giving evidence. Bear in mind, this news came less than 2 weeks before the first day of hearings was supposed to start, and people have already taken their leave from work, may not be able to get more. We're coming up to the end of the year. People don't have days left. The start of the hearings has been put back by 2 weeks, but the timetable has not been released.
So prior to the postponement, the inquiry had only announced the first week of live hearings. The timetable for that was put on their website. In the past, we've always had the full phase listed at a time, but this was just 1 week. But on top of that, the individuals who were being called to give evidence had been given days, certain dates. Jessica, who was in one of the more recent episodes, was saying that it's going to be the 25th of October. She was expecting to give evidence. Obviously, that's all changed now. So we don't know when that's going to be. We did have some ideas for certain days when hearings would be. All that's out the window. They have given some indication about certain days again, but I just wouldn't put any trust in it.
No. And the disclosure that hadn't come, that meant that this delay had to happen, still hasn't come, at least at the time that we're recording. I'm hoping that by the time we put the episode out, then the bundle will all have been published. But there's no guarantees, absolutely no guarantees at all.
The point of this episode partially is that when we're covering the inquiry, which the pair of us do quite closely, it gets a bit, you feel like you don't really want to spend your time criticizing the actual process too much because there's so much content to get out. But the reality of it is that the inquiry has been a shambles for some time now. And it feels like it's getting to a bit of a head where they're just incapable of following any kind of sensible time frame for when hearings are going to happen. Like you said, this is pushing everything back. This Tranche 3 is meant to be happening fairly soon in the new year. Don't know if that's going to be the case anymore. They have got this arbitrary that has to be finished by the end of 2026. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that was ever going to happen.
I don't think it can happen, but the issue is whether it's going to happen or not, they're using that arbitrary date to effectively shut down pretty much everything. So I was in a meeting with somebody from the inquiry legal team on Monday, the 23rd. I was really struck by just how pathetic and rude she was about it all. And it just feels like the worse of a shambles it becomes. I don't know if it's because people are getting defensive or because they just don't care anymore. But, there was no sense of, this is a disaster and we're really sorry. It's not. So we've got the issue with disclosure. It's been going on for a while. The inquiry has acknowledged, I think Mitting described it as we're only human, and they've acknowledged that they're struggling several times, and they have acknowledged that that is causing significant problems for anybody who's trying to take part in the inquiry. But along with the delays that they've announced now, there's a whole bunch of corners that are just going to be cut.
Yeah.
The first thing is counsel to the inquiry is no longer making a long and detailed opening statement. So the opening and closing statements are really important because they synthesize all of that information. There's so much information coming in, gives us an idea of what the inquiry is seeing as important, of what's coming in. None of that's going to happen in the opening to T2P2. A whole bunch of officers are dropping out, and some really significant key officers are dropping out, like John Dines, who I think he lives in Australia, and he's just said, nah, don't want to come. We've been asking the inquiry to use their powers to compel. They do have, under the Inquiries Act, they have powers to compel these officers. But of course, they're in a rush. They're not interested in compelling these officers. And in the meeting, they said, yes, well, we understand, but we don't have any other option but to politely request that they attend. It's like, bollocks. Yes, you do. You've got powers under the Inquiries Act, but they're not willing to use them.
It needs to be stressed that they were never going to call all the officers in the first place. We spent many years going through the process of whittling down the actual officers, the anonymity requirements and the secrecy requirements for which ones they were actually going to call. So it was already quite a limited list. And even with that limited list, significant ones who live abroad have dropped out. It appears the ones who don't even live abroad are dropping out as well. But we had with HN33, who used the cover name Lee Bosner, she dropped out for no discernible reason. We were never given a reason why she dropped out of the first phase of Tranche 2 hearings.
Yeah, but in the first phase of Tranche 2 hearings, when the officers dropped out and refused to give live evidence, the statements that they had made were summarised and read out, and people got an idea of who these officers were, what they were saying, what they'd been doing, and what the evidence was about. They're not going to do that anymore. They've said they're not going to summarise any of the evidence. If an officer doesn't come, they'll publish the written statement on the inquiry website. And it's hard enough to follow this inquiry as it is. But if you don't get the live experience and the oral evidence, it becomes completely obtuse. How many people are actually going to understand and get to see what, well, they might, because we'll probably do a podcast about it. That evidence that's being published, the public inquiry, just has no interest in getting that information to the public in an accessible format.
It totally affects the way in which it gets covered by the media, the very limited way it does get covered by the media. But when a officer's evidence is introduced, that's like a newsworthy thing. We've seen a number of articles in The Guardian that have been published off the back of the fact that there was evidence introduced. I've got to be honest, just if a PDF's being published on a website, that doesn't have the same sort of, it's not going to happen.
No, it's not newsworthy. So yeah, that's hugely problematic. And then possibly the most problematic thing is that they've said, well, we're starting late, so we'll finish late. I think they're talking about finishing at the end of January, but we'll book the venue for January. So after Christmas, it'll all be online. We're not going to book another venue. We're not going to have live hearings. We're just going to put it online. And what's coming then? Well, it's the managers. So what we've got is, yet again, those higher up the chain are being protected. They're not going to have to sit and face the public in a room. They're not going to have to face the people that were damaged by all of this. And they're going to be live streamed with the inquiry's fabulous 10-minute delay, with all the problems that induces when they slip up and say things that they shouldn't have. I think it was the last day of the last round of hearings that we got, 20 minutes of the last afternoon?
An hour and a half's worth of testimony just wasn't broadcast because of all the stoppages, a lot of which were quite spurious, but because of the 10-minute delay, they cut as soon as they think there's a problem. So it cuts the broadcast, which means that sometimes, that was nothing, but we've just lost that 10 minutes. It was an absolute farce. It makes you wonder in terms of what the next phase of hearings is actually going to be like, because one of the officers who's going to be giving evidence is transferred from the last phase. So it means all that's standing now is Coles, Lambert and HN1, who used the cover name Matt Rayner. Those are the only three officers who were originally meant to be giving evidence during these hearings who still will.
Yeah, what we will also have, of course, is the evidence about the other officers from the people that they spied on. And I think there's going to be some interesting stuff there. Obviously, Lambert's going to be fascinating. I am very keen to see that man on the stand. Lambert is one of the most well-known of the spy cops, but also possibly the most controversial, in the sense that he had 4 relationships. He fathered a child whilst undercover. He is accused of planting an incendiary device in a department store whilst he was undercover. The list just goes on. And then, of course, he became manager of the unit. So a lot of what goes on after his deployment is on him as well.
So the last thing we heard from the inquiry about him would be that there'll be 5 days of him giving evidence.
which is the longest, right?
That would be the longest by some distance, yeah. And that there'll be
Yeah.
10 civilian witnesses would be called to give evidence. Now, if all 10 of those can still make it with the new timetable, who knows? Maybe that there's less than 10 now. Maybe there's less than 5 days now. Who knows? Because everything seems to be up in the air. But that was originally the plan. What is a goal? Like we mentioned John Dines, who really, let's be honest, if it wasn't for Helen Steele searching for John Dines, maybe we wouldn't be in this position with the inquiry in the first place.
No, I'm sure it wouldn't.
So the fact that there'll be nothing about him in any of the live hearings is a disgrace, really. But also Mike Chitty, John, neither of those are going to be giving evidence, which they're from this time period. They're essential, really, to understanding the story of the unit, I would argue. And the impact they had on people's lives is huge.
A couple of weeks ago, call participants wrote to the Home Secretary about the crisis that was facing the inquiry. And a lot has happened in the last couple of weeks. We warned the Home Secretary about what was happening, the impact of this compressed timetable and the December 2026 end date and the lack of resources was having, and how it was creating chaos, it was creating unfairness. This inquiry has been running for nearly 10 years now. Almost none of that time was given to hearing evidence, and a very significant chunk of it was the state going through all the evidence and deciding what was too sensitive, what they wanted to cover up, what couldn't be released.
Yeah, I think that's really key to get across to people. When we talk about the huge cost of the inquiry and the huge long-running nature of the inquiry, the vast majority of the time, money, and effort that the inquiry has done has been around secrecy. Firstly, for a supposed public inquiry, the huge cost and time thing is down to the fact that going through these documents, redacting things, coming up with reasons to give anonymity to former police officers. That kind of work has taken years and years, and it feels like all that secrecy stuff has been really the main event as far as the inquiry is concerned. And now when it comes to actually investigating this stuff, like looking at what actually happened, that's going to be done in haste. We're rushing through that, we're sprinting through that part, whilst everything else was done with not a stone left unturned. Years on end of hearings about anonymity. Just ridiculous, really, the way it's turned out.
It's worth saying that the Home Office has not replied to our letter. They did make a statement in the Independent. I guess they made a more general press statement. I saw it in the Independent, but saying that the inquiry was very important and that it had to be effective and it had to be fair. And it's no longer either of those things. In the 2 weeks since we sent that letter, it is just completely deteriorated, and we're seeing the effects of the cost cutting. One of the things that really struck me is that the issue of managers not giving evidence in person. As call participants, we said that we would like to make submissions on that. And the reply that we got from the inquiry was that the chair had made his decision anticipating the submissions that people might want to make, and therefore there was no need. It's just like, yeah, no, we don't want call participants participating in the inquiry anymore. That's too cumbersome. We're just going to guess what you would say and make our decisions. And at some point, the lack of fairness and the lack of participation, something's got to give. But that said, too, is going to be fascinating.
There's a lot in there. Lambert alone, but add in Coles and Rayner, and you've got like some of the particularly noxious people. I think it's definitely going to be worth following in detail. Like we've followed all the hearings in detail. Who knows what shape it's going to be, though, because it's due to start fairly soon and we have no idea.
I think for me, the reason why I'm so angry about this is it's not just a procedural issue. There are people who are deeply traumatized by what these undercover officers did, and this process and the lack of fairness and the pressure and the stress and the lack of time and the fact that we are being squeezed more and more, and they're making it harder and harder. In Tranche 3 is where I'm going to start getting disclosure, and they've already said that they've changed the rules. You can't download or print the documents to work on them anymore because it violates their new security protocol. So we've got to work on them online on their platform. And they're no longer going to be as flexible with deadlines, and you have exceptional reasons, or you basically have to toe the line, or you can fuck off. We don't want your evidence anyway. That's basically the message that people are getting, and it's really upsetting people. It's causing a lot of distress, and of course none of that gets seen either. That's all going on behind the scenes.
I mean, just to say, giving evidence to the inquiry, by definition, requires reliving past trauma. That's what people are doing in the first place. The lack of respect towards the people who are going through that is appalling. We've had quite a lot of turnover of staff of the inquiry over the years. There's very few members of staff that have been there since the beginning. I think maybe Barr is the only one actually of any of the staff that have been there since the very beginning. But
not even the chair has been there since the beginning.
The people that we deal with as co-participants in the inquiry, in the past, some of them previous staff may have come across as being more accommodating than others, but quite frankly, at the moment, we're out of luck completely with any of these people.
Part of that probably is people's personalities, but I think also they are in absolute crisis. The fact that they are missing every deadline and they've just had to put the hearings back and they've cancelled a month's worth of live hearings because they don't have a venue, so they're going to put it online. It's an absolute fucking shit show. And working inside that's probably horrendous.
Yeah, I'm sure it is.
I can't imagine that this situation is good for anyone apart from possibly MI5 and Special Branch, who their only interest is that none of this stuff gets out.
Yeah, absolutely. And for them, this is ideal, I would argue. The way the inquiry has developed over the years suits them down to the ground. With the whole rotating cast, Secretary of the Inquiry, Celia French, has left. She's going to the parole board now. Didn't hear that from the inquiry. It was published in the press.
They haven't told us that yet. In fact, Cecilia French was supposed to come to the meeting I was at on Monday, and she didn't show up at the last minute for personal reasons. I wonder if those personal reasons were she was off to her other job.
Parole board, apparently.
Nobody mentioned that. And we have no idea who's going to be taking her place either.
If anybody wants to take it on at this kind of short notice before a bunch of hearings, it wouldn't surprise me if there's...
Oh, fuck's sake, I'll do it.
It comes back to what we've been saying since the very begining. It would be a lot easier for them to do this entire inquiry if they just released the information to those of us who are affected.
Yeah.
And we'll soon get to the truth of all of it. Thank you very much.
No, I know. It's just mental.
But the inquiry has never wanted the help of those who are obviously the most interested and have got the most stake in the proceedings. It's never really wanted our involvement, but less so than ever now.
Public inquiries are not actually really about getting to the truth, are they? Public inquiries are a very peculiar British thing. When the state's worried about public concern about something and they hold a public inquiry in order to make the issue go away, really. And I think it's testament to the people who have stuck at this and been campaigning for all this time that the issue hasn't gone away. It is getting beyond a joke at this point, I have to say.
I always underline, I don't believe in British justice. I don't believe in that any of these judges and lawyers are ever going to be equipped to actually deal with what the problem with the British state is. What we get out of this process is the disclosure, it's the live evidence. It's not really about the actual institution itself or the process, the whole thing itself. But it is incredibly frustrating when you've got an organisation that's purporting to do one thing and is doing pretty much the other. And is not even very good at doing that. It's a lot easier to deal with these horrible bastards if they're efficient. But when they're inefficient as well, it's like, oh, Jesus.
I know. This idea that you can be rude and arrogant and incompetent. It really gets my goat. I don't mind working with rude, arrogant, competent, efficient people if I have to. But rude, arrogant, and incompetent, there is no saving that. Anyway, the point of this podcast was really to take advantage of this little bit of breathing space that we've got to tell people what's going on behind the scenes. And procedurally, what's going on behind the scenes is absolute chaos. We are waiting still for a reply from the Home Secretary. And there is a chance that some of this might be redeemed. But what is also going on behind the scenes is very interesting material has been disclosed to witnesses who will be making statements. And although the cops are dodging and the inquiry is letting them, their victims will be there. Their victims will be giving evidence. And there's going to be some really interesting stuff talked about this time around. I think like Dines, Lambert and some of the others, they're referred to as the cabal by their own colleague. So this is like a kind of secret unit of power within a secret undercover policing unit. That's what we're coming to now. And I think somebody referred to them as the court of the Star Chamber as well, and that they would go in and ask managers and senior officers to leave and be obeyed. These are people who really, really had lost the plot quite badly.
Yeah, I heard that around Stephen Scott. Bob Lambert grabbed HN 106 and held him up against the wall because he disagreed with him. This is a senior officer. It's quite surprising, really, that they're carrying on like this. I mean, unlike the other phases of the inquiry, phase 1 and 2 of Tranche 2 is not chronological. We heard a lot about these officers from the officers during the previous phase. And they paint a picture of there being definitely two sides of the hall. And the way that the inquiry split up these phases was to do the less important, if you like, officers on the beginning, plus Roger Pierce, was slightly earlier than these other guys. And then the cabal during phase 2. And it seems like John Dine's really central to that. He's managed to get out of it. But with previous sets of the inquiry, I've done like a visitor's guide of what to expect, who's going to be giving evidence, what they're going to be talking about. Haven't been able to do that yet because even though by the time this comes out, it's going to be 2 weeks away from the start of the inquiry again, don't have a timetable, don't have an idea who's going to be when. But I will be doing that once that information does come out.
Yeah, and we will be doing the weekly summaries and we'll be summarising the opening statements. And of course, even though counsel to the inquiry are not going to be doing a proper introductory opening statement this time, our legal teams are working very hard with the material that they have as and when it gets released to make sure that there is a good rundown of what's coming up. So watch this space because it will be possible to follow it and it is going to be really, really interesting. But be aware that there's a lot that is not going to be seen. So what you're seeing is going to be the tip of the iceberg, really.
Yeah, when we set out all those years ago with the start of the inquiry, we set out to do coverage of it, to demystify it and get people to understand it as it was happening, because we knew that the media was never going to do that. I wasn't expecting it to be this complex. I knew it was going to be a bit complex, but I wasn't quite expecting, like the term public inquiry is a complete misnomer. It's not particularly inquisitive and it's definitely not very public. But as you say, we will be covering it in detail. Every day I'll be live tweeting the hearings as they happen. I'll be doing videos in the breaks with a reaction to what's just been said. And at the end of each day, I'll be doing the spaces on Twitter, just reflecting on the day. But I really encourage people, if you are interested in this stuff, this is quite rare to have this. The hearings are a very, very unusual thing to get a former undercover officer on the stand being asked probing questions. I really recommend, if you are interested, to come along to some of these hearings. They opened registration and they shut it again because it's all moved around. But as soon as registration is open again, I'll be making an announcement about it. I'll put it on all the social media. I really recommend if you only come down for one afternoon, it is worthwhile. Particularly, I think Lambert, is going to be a fairly big crowd, but Coles, I think, equally will be just as interesting. HM1, whatever you can make it down to, it'll be really good. If there was someone there who, if you were affected in any way, one of your comrades is speaking, come down and give them some support. There will be a protest on the first day of the live hearings, as there always has been. Every set of live hearings, we've had a protest outside on the first day of them.
So that'll be 9 o'clock outside the hearing on the 21st of October, which is the first day of live hearings, because the week before that, you get the opening statements, but they're delivered online. They're not actually done live. So it's only when the witnesses start that we go to the venue. So yeah, 9 o'clock, 21st of October on the steps of the inquiry venue, which is where? I can't remember.
It's right outside St. Paul's Cathedral.
Oh, okay.
So the International Dispute Resolution Centre, it literally, you're surrounded by tourists on your way in. You have to dodge the open bus tours as you go in. Literally, like thousands of American tourists on one side, and then you go around the corner to go and get your lunch. And there's like a million city boys who've just fallen out of the stock exchange getting paninis and wraps. It's a weird place. It's a very strange spot to be hanging out, and certainly nowhere that I would ever find myself normally. But are you going to be following things on a regular basis during this set of hearings?
I will be around, certainly. I haven't made my plans yet.
That's lucky, because everything's changed.
Because I don't really know what's going on. All the people who did make their plans and book their travel are having to change their tickets and buy last-minute British Rail, which is always a good one. I guessed that it was going to be a bit like this, and I haven't made a plan yet. But as soon as there's a timetable, I will be planning on being around for a fair bit of it.
Apologies to everybody on the email list who I emailed about 6 hours before the inquiry changed the dates, telling everybody when the inquiry hearings were going to start. I was all out of date. So yeah, if you want to sign up to that, please get in touch. Spycops.info, you'll find all the information. Thanks for joining us. So we thought we'd finish, but we hadn't, as ever with the Undercover Policing Inquiry. As much as you're annoyed about them, don't worry. Something else will come along to annoy you even more in a few moments.
Yeah, so today the inquiry published the ruling on applications.
So we recorded everything you've just listened to on Tuesday. This is Thursday now, and we've had more off the inquiry.
We haven't had a reply to our letter to the Home Office. We haven't had any constructive feedback from the inquiry about any of the issues that we have raised. What we have had is a ruling from the inquiry on the applications made by political groups that were targeted by both the SDS and the MPORU, which the inquiry recently made clear it would not be considering for disclosure and requesting witness statements from those groups because they weren't considered by the inquiry to be core participants. Groups including the International Solidarity Movement, which worked around Palestine, the Wombles for Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty, various social centres and squatted buildings around the country that were targeted, Dissent, which organised the mobilisation around the G8 summit in 2005, Indomedia, which we know was used tactically by certainly the MPORU and possibly other officers from the SDS, and Disarm Dicey, the protests against the annual arms fair in London, all of which were targeted by numerous undercover officers from both the Special Demonstration Squad and the National Public Order Intelligence Unit, which would be particularly significant in tranches 3 and 4 coming up, some of which were specifically named as targets of those operations. Mitting has said that it's not necessary to his terms of reference to do any kind of specific investigation into those groups because they're not core participants. And when we understood that would be their approach in T3 and T4, so in tranches 1 and 2, they have take applications from core participants to say, I was involved in this group, which I think is of specific interest to the inquiry, and I want disclosure about that group. They have agreed to that. That was done with the Trafalgar Square defendants campaign around the poll tax protests. It was done with the 121 Social Centre in Brixton. But because we're running out of time, that will not be done in tranches 3 and 4. So we applied for core participant status for those groups and it has been refused. And what the ruling actually said is it would give rise to the most time-consuming and troublesome of tasks. The inquiry doesn't have time, lacks the time and resources to undertake the exercise, and it wouldn't be a reasonable burden to impose on the state to ask them to consider also investigating spying on those groups. So that's the ruling that has been published today. Yeah, I don't really know how we're supposed to react. If you look at the people that the inquiry has designated core participants for tranches 3 and 4, it looks like there's a lot of core participants, but for tranche 4, most of them are people who were arrested at Ratcliffe-on-Soar, which means that's on the face of it, the only witness evidence that they will actually be asking people about will be Mark Kennedy's involvement in the Ratcliffe-on-Soar climate protest arrests.
This is something we've seen from the inquiry before. We saw it during tranche 1, where lots of the groups the undercover cops were deployed into didn't have any representatives giving any kind of evidence. But we had this really long running, it took best part of a day and a half, maybe 2 days, of looking at one particular incident related to the wrongful arrest of a couple of people on an anti-apartheid demonstration that was happening before the British and Irish Lions went on tour to apartheid South Africa. Huge amounts of hyperfixation on tiny details of that. I really feel like I was almost there at the Star Hotel when it happened. So much detail if I learned about it. Are we going to see a repeat of that again in tranche 4 with the Radcliffe case? I'm not denying that both these events were massive miscarriages of justice, but given the huge levels of abuses that these undercover cops took part in, it seems really weird that we've just got these tiny little moments that are getting a lot of scrutiny and so much which is getting no scrutiny at all.
The inquiry has a fixation on the miscarriages of justice issue, which obviously is important, and it has a fixation on the justification for the deployments, which obviously is important to the state because they don't want to admit that the entire process over 50 years and millions of pounds of public money was actually completely unnecessary in a democratic society and generally abuse of state powers. So those are things that it's particularly keen to focus on. And obviously, one of the things that we're particularly keen to focus on, and which is also part of the inquiry's terms of reference, but doesn't get anything like as much attention, is the impact that these operations will have had, not only on individuals, which is important, but also on public life, on political processes. The inquiry has shown itself very unwilling to look at the ideological motivations behind what was happening here with the undercover policing. The British state has a long tradition of refusing to recognise that there is anything political in their repressive tactics, that this is all just about criminality. Even the IRA, they refused to actually treat them as political prisoners. They said they're in prison for crimes and there's nothing political, nothing to see here. Not that I wish to compare what these groups to the IRA, obviously, that was not my intention. But I think it is significant that there isn't time and there isn't inclination and there aren't resources and there is no political will on the part of the inquiry to look at the wider implications in terms of British public life and politics of the way that these groups were targeted. And it's something that they are willing to look at individuals. But I know from a lot of the disclosure that I've seen that some of the most significant evidence is about the strategic decisions that were being made about which groups to target and why. And also, if you want to look at the lawfulness of any of these operations, one of the things that's absolutely key is to consider what other intelligence they had coming in. And so the fact that at Earth First gatherings and at the dissent mobilisations, there were often at least 2, sometimes 5 or 6 police officers from different units within the Metropolitan Police, often gathering intelligence on each other. I've seen reports from Mark Kennedy about Jason Bishop and how necessary was it to have all of those officers in the space. And I think one thing that the inquiry is going to completely fail to look at, given the approach that it's taking, is the breadth of the intrusion. So they will look at the very specific depth of intrusion into people's lives. So the relationships that officers had with individual core participants, or the impact that officers had on particular criminal processes and miscarriages of justice. But there is a lack of willingness to look at the scope and the breadth of that intrusion and the resulting impact on British politics. And I think that's where they are going to fall down by failing to look at this stuff.
Absolutely. The role that the first summer gatherings played in the deployment of undercover cops into our generation of activism really can't be understated. It's how they all came into the movement. And there was a huge focus on dissent and the anti-summit mobilisations, particularly my experience with Jacobs. That was his main interest. And it seemed to be the case for a lot of the officers. It was these big events by these large networks. I really feel like if lots of people who are core participants now applied, they wouldn't get core participant status. It feels like the inquiry just refuses people across the board. It's too much work. It's too much effort. And they're quite open about it. It's the effort. We can't be bothered. That's literally what they're saying.
We don't have the time or resources. And that brings us back to the issue that we're raising and the letter that we wrote to the Home Office. And all that stuff has already been raised. The Home Office is aware of it. The inquiry is aware of it. And they're just letting it get worse and worse. There is no attempt being made to stop that. And I think here we're getting into areas of severe negligence on the part of the inquiry, because some of the groups that were making those applications are specifically named as targets of undercover operations. Into post-2000, the Human Rights Act is in effect. We come to the creation of the police's own national intelligence model minimum standards for what makes an operation lawful, and decisions to target specific groups and individuals, but decisions to target specific groups need to be underwritten by a whole range of strategic documents and intelligence cases that nobody is going to see and nobody is going to get an opportunity to challenge. The inquiry may publish them in their hearing bundle, but they're not going to be giving them to witnesses, and they're not going to be allowing those groups to respond to and challenge the targeting decisions that were made. And I think that actually the inquiry is starting to stray into complete dereliction of duty when it comes to meeting their terms of reference. I don't know what recourse we have to respond to that, really, beyond shouting about it on a podcast. But yes, I think we certainly need to look into it.
We're recording this on Thursday. This should be released on Monday. So the inquiry was originally meant to be meeting today. It isn't. It'll be 2 weeks later. Who knows what form that's going to take? The more we hear from the inquiry, the more depressing it gets. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
No, not bye at all. We thought we finished. We haven't finished. There is more. We're recording yet another edition. We've heard more from the inquiry. This is the Friday. Hopefully I'll get this edited in time to go out on the Monday. But yeah, we've heard yet more from the inquiry. And guess what? None of it's good.
It feels like it's coming thick and fast now. So the latest that we heard from lawyers last night was that no officers at all will be giving evidence in October or November. So basically, what we're going to have is the victims of these officers. We're talking, we said this already, but nasty officers, people like John Dines and Bob Lambert. And
well, John Dines isn't giving evidence at all.
Oh, well, John Dines isn't giving evidence at all, of course. But anyway, the victims of these operations are going to give their evidence, and then the inquiry is going to let a bit of time go by so that everyone can forget all about that. And then we will hear from the officers themselves. So it's going to be interesting to see how much of the really shocking stuff that you hear from their victims actually gets into the questioning that is put to these officers when they take the stands. But it really does feel like they're trying to sanitize and bear in mind there's very few officers giving evidence at all in this tranche.
It's meant to be 5, then it's meant to be 4. We don't know what the current numbers are, but we assume 4 because that's the last thing the inquiry's told us. They're going to be fitted in between the 1st of December and the 19th, where there's the break for Christmas. So it's a very short period of time. Given that some of these officers are meant to be giving out evidence for 5 days, it's pretty much going to be solid officers' evidence, you'd imagine. Now, to be charitable to the inquiry, it could be that the big gap in between the victims giving evidence and the officers giving evidence is to tailor the questions from the new information that's been gleaned from that live evidence from the victims. I mean, I doubt it somewhat, but that's one charitable reading.
No, I suspect that they've moved the dates and they've contacted the officers and they've said, oh, no, couldn't possibly. December, we'll let you know. There's no timetable yet. All we know is that there won't be evidence from officers in the first 2 months. We still don't have a timetable for anything else.
We don't. We have a very basic idea that the opening statements will be on the 14th and 15th. They'll be virtual. There'll just be 2 days of opening statements, which is much less than normal. And then on the 21st, we start the live hearings. We then break after only 1 week of live hearings for a well-deserved rest for the week commencing the 28th of October. And there'll be another 1 week break from the week commencing the 18th of November.
It's important to remember that the inquiry is only sitting Monday to Thursday, or not even. The first week is only 2 days, as you say.
Now that the hearings will be taking place in January as well, the break will be the 19th of December till the 5th of January, which is good of them. Beyond that, we have no idea about the timetable. There will be no closing statements either at the end of our tranche phase, which at the end of each tranche, there's normally closing statements, or there was at the end of tranche 1. We won't be having those at all. Though they are changing the layout, apparently they've confirmed. This is, unless you go there in person, you wouldn't even be aware of this. But when you are in the public gallery, you actually don't see that much unless you stand up and look around. If you're sat down, you can't actually see the chair. But that will be changed. He's going on stage. I'm sure that was one of the easiest submissions we made. Oh, sir, we can't see you very well. Well, build a massive stage so you can see me better. So that's happening.
One of the people who was involved in that exchange said to me that it was an indication of just how much chaos and panic there must be inside the inquiry team, how happy they were to be able to bring that bit of good news. You asked for the stage, we've got you the stage. We haven't got you any evidence, we haven't got you any officers, but we've got a stage.
As it stands, there's been no further disclosure throughout the week. The reason for the delay, the fact that they need to get the disclosure out, that still isn't out. We still haven't heard from the Home Secretary. There are no positive updates, really, beyond the stage.
But, there'll be a stage. There will also be a screen, I believe.
Yes, there's an extra screen.
It's basically going to be like a Bon Jovi concert.
Jesus Christ, living on a prayer. That's pretty much it. Please do join us when we finally do start covering this thing. I feel this podcast episode's gone on forever. It's taken all week to record, but new information kept coming out and it just seemed ridiculous to release it without giving you the latest updates. Hopefully this time for real. Thanks for joining us. We'll be starting again on the 14th. That'll be virtual. From the 21st, it'll be live. So please do tune in. Please support. Please help share anything that you see that comes out. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you. And yes, see you 9 a.m. at the steps of the Dispute Resolution Centre on the 21st of October.
Yes, see you there.